Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a street. Not a modern street. Not the one outside your window with its parked cars and its sodium lighting and its distant sound of traffic. An older street. A London street. On a November evening in 1852, in one of the long terraces of identical brick houses that stretched in every direction from the city's center like the spokes of a wheel. The pavement is uneven stone, slicked with rain and horse traffic, and something else you would rather not examine too closely. The air is thick, not metaphorically thick, but physically thick, carrying the coal smoke of 10,000 domestic fires and the particular smell of a city that has not yet solved the problem of what to do with its own waste. Gas lamps stand at intervals along the street, casting pools of yellowish light that are more suggestive than illuminating. Between them, the darkness is genuine, the kind of darkness that modern city dwellers almost never experience, where the spaces between lights are actually dark, where a figure approaching from 20 yards away is a shape rather than a person until they step into the lamp's reach. And behind the identical facades, the black-painted front doors, the polished brass knockers, the white-painted window sashes, the narrow front gardens with their iron railings. Life is happening. In every house on the street, in every room, at every level from the kitchen below ground to the attic rooms at the top, human beings are doing what human beings do in the hours between dinner and sleep. Reading, talking, worrying about money, listening to someone play the piano in the front parlor, carrying a coal scuttle up 3 flights of stairs, feeding a baby, writing a letter by the light of a candle that is not quite enough to see by. Tonight, we are going inside, not into one house, but into all of them, into the hidden daily life of the Victorian London house in the middle years of the 19th century, into the rooms that most history books skip over because they are not dramatic enough, not political enough, not sufficiently connected to the great events of the age, into the ordinary life that was happening, constantly and invisibly, behind every front door in every street of the largest city in the world. It is a world that is closer to us than we might think, and stranger than we are prepared for. Let us begin with the street itself, because the street is where everything starts. In 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition, the year that London announced itself to the world as the center of a civilization, at its confident peak, the city had a population of approximately 2.5 million people. It was the largest city in the world by a considerable margin. Paris, its nearest rival in European terms, had around 1 million. New York was growing fast, but had not yet reached 1 million. London, at 2.5 million, was something genuinely new in human history, a city at a scale that had never existed before, that had grown faster than any city had ever grown, that had expanded outward in every direction with a speed and a disorder that its own inhabitants found simultaneously thrilling and alarming. The growth had been so rapid that the infrastructure of the city had simply not kept pace with it. The streets, the drainage, the water supply, the housing, all of it was Victorian improvisation on a medieval and Georgian foundation, layered one on top of the other in ways that were sometimes ingenious and sometimes dangerous, and frequently both at once. Fact 1. The address you lived at in 1850s London was not simply a piece of information. It was a social declaration of the most precise and consequential kind. London's residential geography in the mid-Victorian period was organized around class with a clarity that was almost cartographic. You could, if you knew what to look for, determine a family's income, occupation, social standing, and ambitions from the street they lived on with a high degree of accuracy. The grandest addresses were in the West End, Mayfair, Belgravia, Kensington, where the aristocracy and the very wealthy maintained townhouses of 4, 5, and 6 stories, with servants numbering in the dozens and stabling for horses at the rear. Below them, in terms of social geography, came the solid middle-class streets of Bloomsbury, Islington, Canonbury, and Brixton, long terraces of 3- and 4-story houses occupied by lawyers, doctors, merchants, clerks, and the broad middle layer of Victorian professional society. Below them again were the smaller terraces and back streets of the working-class districts, where the houses diminished in size and in quality and in the thickness of the walls and in the depth of the front garden, until they became, in the worst districts, single rooms in decaying buildings that had once been something else and had been subdivided until they could barely be called houses at all. The address announced all of this. A Mayfair address meant one thing. A Bloomsbury address meant another. An address in Bermondsey or Bethnal Green meant something else entirely. Not simply a location, but a social condition, a set of economic circumstances, a life expectancy that was measurably shorter than that of someone living 3 miles to the west. Fact 2. The typical middle-class Victorian terraced house in London, the kind that appears in every period drama, that lines the streets of Islington and Canonbury and parts of Brixton and Camberwell that have since become expensive, was built to a remarkably consistent plan. It was the product of speculative development, built not by architects working to individual commissions, but by builders working to a standard template, constructing streets of identical houses and selling them to whoever would buy. The house was typically between 3 and 5 stories tall, depending on its position in the social hierarchy. It was built of London stock brick, a yellowish brick manufactured from the brick earth found around the Thames estuary, which gives Victorian London much of its characteristic color. The front was faced with stucco, a smooth plaster coating, on the more aspirational examples, and left in plain brick on the more modest ones. The windows were sash windows, divided into panes, with heavy wooden frames painted white. The front door was in most cases painted black, with a brass knocker and a letterbox slot, and approached by a short flight of stone steps rising from street level. Below street level, accessed by a separate staircase descending from the pavement, was the basement. This was the servants' domain, the kitchen, the scullery, the coal cellar, the larder, the servants' hall if the house was large enough. A below-ground world that existed in a different physical and social register from the floors above, and that was connected to the upper house by a narrow back staircase that servants used to move between the two worlds invisibly, or as invisibly as possible. Fact 3. The front steps of a Victorian terraced house were more than an architectural feature. They were a social statement, maintained accordingly. Keeping the front steps clean, whitened with a specific preparation called hearthstone or donkey stone, applied by the housemaid on her knees first thing in the morning, was one of the first and most visible domestic duties of the day. A house with dirty steps was a house where standards were slipping, where the mistress had lost control of her household, where something was wrong. A house with gleaming white steps was a house in order, a house of respectable people who understood their obligations to the street. This sounds like a small thing. In the context of Victorian social life, it was not. The maintenance of domestic appearances was a matter of genuine social consequence in the middle-class streets of 1850s London, where everyone could see everyone else's steps and where the judgment of neighbors was a real and daily pressure. The front of the house was a public face, and it was maintained with the same attention that was given to the face one wore in company, because in both cases, the audience was watching and the stakes were understood. Fact 4. The typical floor plan of a London terraced house of the 1950s proceeded from the street downward and upward in a strict social hierarchy. The basement held the kitchen, scullery, and storage. The ground floor held the dining room at the rear and the morning room or library at the front. The first floor, the piano nobile, as architects called it, the main reception level, held the drawing room, usually running the full width of the house, with tall windows and the best furnishings. The second floor held the master bedroom and perhaps a dressing room. The upper floors held the children's rooms and the governess's room. The attic held the servants' sleeping quarters. Each level was a step up or down in the social hierarchy of the house, and the movement of different people through the house was governed by elaborate and largely unspoken conventions about who used which stairs, which doors, which rooms, and at what times. The servants used the back staircase. Family used the front staircase. Tradespeople came to the basement entrance, never the front door. Visitors were admitted to the hall by the maid and shown to the drawing room by the butler or the parlor maid. The household was a machine for maintaining social distinctions, and every architectural feature of it served that machine. Fact 5. The drawing room, the formal reception room of the Victorian middle-class house, was a room of considerable social and psychological significance. It was where the family received visitors, where the piano stood, where the best furniture was arranged, where the family gathered in the evenings. It was also, in many houses, a room that was kept in a state of anticipatory readiness for company that might or might not arrive, maintained at a standard of decoration and cleanliness that bore little relationship to its actual daily use. Victorian drawing rooms were furnished with a density and variety that modern taste finds overwhelming, but that the Victorians experienced as richness, comfort, and cultural attainment. Every surface was covered. The mantelpiece with its clock and its ornaments and its framed photographs, the walls with their framed prints and paintings and sometimes mirrors, the tables with their arrangements of books and magazines and decorative objects, the shelves with their collections of china and glass and curiosities. The curtains were heavy, in velvet or damask or brocade, layered over net undercurtains and tied back with elaborate fabric sashes. The room was, in effect, a portrait of the family, a three-dimensional biography assembled from objects that declared who they were, what they had achieved, where they had traveled, what they valued, and how they wished to be perceived. Every object had a story, and every story was a social argument. Fact 6. Gaslighting arrived in London's domestic interiors gradually through the 1840s and 1850s, and by the middle of the decade, a reasonably prosperous London household would typically have gas burners in the main reception rooms and in the hall, with candles and oil lamps still used in the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the upper floors where the gas pipes had not been extended. The gas burners of the 1850s were not the efficient, controlled appliances of the later Victorian period. They were simple open flames, burning with a yellowish light that was considerably brighter than a candle, but produced a significant amount of heat, a faint smell of gas, and, over the course of an evening, a perceptible deterioration in the quality of the air in the room. A drawing room with 5 or 6 gas burners lit, and a fire burning, and a dozen people in it would, by 10 o'clock in the evening, have air that was notably stuffy, slightly headache-inducing, and warm enough that the ladies would be using their fans regardless of the season. The Victorians were aware of this. Ventilation was a genuine concern of Victorian domestic architecture. The need to admit fresh air without admitting cold was a design challenge that exercised architects and domestic advice writers throughout the period. The solutions were various and not always effective. Some houses had ventilation shafts built into the chimney breasts. Some had windows with fixed ventilation lights at the top. Many simply relied on the fact that Victorian construction was rarely airtight enough to prevent considerable air movement regardless of what the windows were doing. Fact 7. Candles in the 1850s were a more complex subject than the word suggests. There were several kinds, at significantly different prices, used in different rooms and by different members of the household. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were cheap, widely available, and produced a dim, recurring, somewhat malodorous flame. They were used in the kitchen, the servants' quarters, and anywhere that economy was more important than quality. Wax candles, made from beeswax, were expensive, burned cleanly, and were used in the best rooms when company was expected, in the candlesticks on the dining table, in the bedroom candlesticks carried by the family when they retired for the night. Stearin candles, made from a fatty acid derived from animal fat, introduced commercially in the 1840s, were harder, burned more slowly, and were less malodorous than tallow, at a price between tallow and beeswax. They rapidly became the standard domestic candle for middle-class households who wanted something better than tallow but could not justify the expense of beeswax throughout the house. The management of candles, their purchase, their storage, their distribution to different parts of the house, the salvage and reuse of candle ends, was a recognized part of the housekeeper's duties, and the expenditure on candles appeared as a regular line in household accounts. Light was not free, or cheap, or taken for granted. It was a resource to be managed. Fact 8. The coal fire was the heart of the Victorian house in a way that no subsequent heating system has been. Not simply because it was the only source of heat, though in most rooms it was, but because it was the only source of light and heat simultaneously, because it was alive in a way that a radiator is not, because it required attention and management, because it created a focal point for every room it was in, and organized the social life of that room around itself. Every room in a Victorian house that was intended to be inhabited had a fireplace. The drawing room had a fireplace. The dining room had a fireplace. The bedrooms had fireplaces. The kitchen had its range. A large iron cooking stove that burned coal continuously and provided both heat for cooking and warmth for the kitchen. Even the attic rooms where the servants slept often had small grates, though whether they were actually lit in those rooms was a matter of the household's economy and the employer's generosity. The hierarchy of fires in the house was a precise reflection of the social hierarchy within it. The drawing room fire was the best, laid with the best coal, maintained most carefully, kept burning longest. The dining room fire was comparable. The morning room fire might be allowed to go out in the afternoon if the room was not in use. The bedroom fires were lit in the evening and allowed to die overnight. The servants' quarters received heat as a function of whatever warmth rose through the house from the floors below, supplemented by the body heat of whoever was sleeping in the room. Fact 9. The coal cellar was a fundamental feature of every London house in the 1850s, and its contents, or lack of contents, were a reliable indicator of the household's financial situation. Coal was delivered by the coalman, who arrived with his cart and horse and carried the coal down through a hatch in the pavement to the cellar below. The sound of the coal delivery, the rumble of the cart, the clatter of the coal down the chute, the coalman's call in the street, was one of the regular rhythms of Victorian domestic life, as predictable and as necessary as the bread delivery and the milk delivery. A well-provisioned household kept its cellar well stocked, buying coal in quantity when prices were low in summer and drawing on the reserve through the winter. A household under financial pressure ran its cellar low, bought coal in small quantities at the less favorable prices of the retail trade, and sometimes faced the particular domestic crisis of a cold morning with an empty grate and no money for coal. This was not an uncommon situation. The management of coal, like the management of candles, like the management of food, like the management of every other domestic resource, was an exercise in household economics that fell primarily on the wife and housekeeper, conducted largely invisibly, and judged by the comfort or discomfort of the household that resulted. Fact 10. The Victorian kitchen was located in the basement, separated from the dining room above by at least one flight of stairs, and in some houses by 2 or 3. This arrangement was deliberate. The smells, sounds, and general commotion of cooking were considered incompatible with the decorum of the floors above, and the kitchen was positioned as far from the family's living spaces as the architecture of the house allowed. The inconvenience of this arrangement was considerable. Food prepared in the basement kitchen had to be carried up the back stairs to the dining room above, often by a single maid carrying multiple dishes. Hot food arrived cool, sauces congealed. The timing of a formal dinner, which required multiple courses to arrive at the table in a specific order and at an acceptable temperature, was an exercise in logistics of considerable complexity, depending on precise coordination between the cook in her kitchen and the parlour-maid in the dining room, and the mistress of the house managing the whole operation from somewhere in between. The cook's authority in her kitchen was, in most households, absolute. The kitchen was her domain, and within it, she commanded her underlings with the same expectation of obedience that the mistress of the house commanded in the rooms above. The relationship between the cook and the mistress of the house was one of the most delicate and most consequential relationships in the Victorian domestic hierarchy, a negotiation of authority between two women in a context where neither could entirely do without the other, and where the balance of power shifted depending on the cook's competence, the mistress's confidence, and the general state of the household's finances. Fact. 11. The kitchen range, the large iron cooking stove that dominated every Victorian kitchen, was one of the most demanding pieces of domestic machinery ever installed in a private house. It ran continuously, fueled by coal, requiring constant management of its dampers and flues to maintain the different temperatures needed for different cooking tasks. It had to be cleaned daily, the iron surfaces blackened with a preparation called blacking, the steel parts polished, the ash removed from the firebox, the flues cleared of soot at regular intervals. The range provided heat for the kitchen, welcome in winter, suffocating in summer, and hot water for the house through a back boiler connected to it, a system that was efficient when it worked, and a source of considerable domestic disruption when it did not. The cook's relationship with the range was one of the most intimate working relationships in the Victorian house. She understood its particular characteristics, its hot spots and its cool spots, its reliable behaviors and its unpredictable ones, and she adjusted her cooking accordingly. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, devoted considerable space to the management of the kitchen range, reflecting the fact that competent operation of this machine was considered a fundamental skill of domestic life. Mrs. Beeton's book, and the woman who wrote it, who was 25 years old when it was published and died 4 years later at 29 of puerperal fever, is one of the remarkable artifacts of the Victorian domestic world, a comprehensive guide to running a middle-class household that was both a practical manual and a social document of extraordinary density and specificity. Fact 12. Water in 1850s London was a subject of considerable complexity and considerable danger. The city was supplied by a combination of private water companies, parish pumps, and wells, none of which provided a consistent, reliable, or, in many cases, safe supply. The connection between contaminated water and cholera, which killed thousands of Londoners in the epidemics of 1832, 1849, and 1853, was established definitively by the physician John Snow in his analysis of the Broad Street cholera outbreak of 1854, in which he traced the source of an epidemic in Soho to a single contaminated pump. Snow's work, now recognized as one of the founding acts of epidemiology, was not immediately accepted by the medical establishment, which largely still subscribed to the miasma theory. The idea that disease was caused by bad air, by the smell of rotting matter, by the general atmospheric corruption of an overcrowded and insanitary city. The miasma theory was wrong in its mechanism, but not entirely wrong in its observation. The places in London with the worst smells were also, as a practical matter, the places with the worst water, because both the smell and the bad water came from the same source, which was the catastrophic inadequacy of the city's drainage. Fact 13. The piped water supply in a middle-class London house of the 1850s was, where it existed at all, available only on the ground floor or basement, from a single cold tap connected to the water company's mains. Hot water did not come out of a tap. It was heated in the kitchen range's back boiler, in pots on the range, in kettles hung over the fire, and then carried by hand to wherever it was needed. A bath for a family member required multiple trips up the stairs with cans of hot water, filling a portable metal bath that was brought to the bedroom for the purpose and removed afterward. The amount of physical labor involved in simply keeping a Victorian household supplied with hot water is difficult to overstate. Every morning, cans of hot water were carried to every occupied bedroom so that the family could wash. Every bath required multiple heavy cans carried up multiple flights of stairs. Every laundry day, which in most households was a specific day of the week, usually Monday, required the heating of vast quantities of water in the wash copper in the scullery. The water itself had to be carried in, used, and then carried out or pumped out, because the drainage of a Victorian house was often as limited as its supply. Verse 14. The privy, the outdoor toilet that most London houses still relied on in the 1850s, located in the back garden or the backyard, was one of the great health hazards of the Victorian city. Connected in most cases to a cesspit beneath the garden, which was periodically emptied by night soilmen who came after dark and removed the contents in carts. The privy was a source of groundwater contamination that affected not just the house it belonged to, but every house in the vicinity whose water supply came from a well sunk into the same ground. The water closet, the flushing toilet, existed and was available in the 1850s, but its installation was not universal, and in many cases it made things worse rather than better, because the flush water carried the waste into the existing cesspit, or, increasingly, directly into the street drains, which led eventually to the Thames. By the 1850s, the Thames through London was, effectively, an open sewer of colossal proportions, and in the hot summer of 1858, 4 years after our story's main period, the smell from the river became so overwhelming that Parliament had to suspend its sittings, an event that became known as the Great Stink, and that finally forced the construction of Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer System, which is still in operation today. Fact 15. The smell of a Victorian London house was one of its defining characteristics, and one that no amount of historical nostalgia can quite sanitize. Coal smoke was everywhere, in the curtains, in the upholstery, in the hair and clothes of everyone who lived in the house, in the walls themselves, which darkened over time to a shade that painters of the period called smoke brown, and that modern restorers find under layers of subsequent paint in almost every Victorian interior they work on. Beneath the coal smoke were the smells of cooking, roasting meat, boiling vegetables, baking bread, the particular sweetness of a Victorian kitchen in which food was prepared from raw ingredients in large quantities every day. Beneath those were the smells of the house's animal life, the horses in the mews behind, whose presence was announced by the smell of their manure and their bedding, the dogs that many families kept, the occasional cat, the mice that were a universal presence in Victorian houses, and that no amount of domestic management entirely eliminated. And beneath all of those, in the most honest accounting, was the smell of the privy, the cesspit, the drains, the smell of a city that was producing waste at a rate that its infrastructure could not absorb, and that settled into the fabric of every house that stood above the ground on which that waste accumulated. The Victorians were not unaware of this. They used enormous quantities of what they called room scent, potpourri, lavender water, eau de cologne, incense, the resinous smoke of certain wood fires, to manage the domestic smell environment. They opened windows when they could, though the air outside was not noticeably cleaner than the air inside. They changed their clothes frequently by the standards of previous generations, and they washed themselves, and they kept their houses swept and scrubbed, with an attention to visible cleanliness that was also, partly, an attention to invisible odor. They lived in a world that smelled, profoundly and constantly, and they managed it with the tools they had. Fact 16. The Victorian servant hierarchy was one of the most precisely graded social structures in the domestic world. In a large household, the kind maintained by a prosperous lawyer or a successful merchant in a 4-story house in Bloomsbury, the servants might number 6 to 8, each with a specific title, specific duties, and a specific place in the order of precedence that governed their meals, their sleeping quarters, their days off, and their general treatment. At the top of the female servant hierarchy was the housekeeper. In larger houses, a woman of considerable authority and middle age, who managed the female staff, controlled the household stores, kept the accounts, and served as the practical administrator of the household. Below her was the cook, who was not subordinate to the housekeeper in her own domain, the kitchen, and whose relationship with the housekeeper is often a negotiation of competing authorities. Below the cook were the housemaids, the parlor maid, the kitchen maid, and the scullery maid, a descending hierarchy of status and wages, with the scullery maid at the bottom doing the hardest, dirtiest, and most poorly paid work in the house. In smaller households, the majority of middle-class London homes in the 1850s, the servant hierarchy was compressed accordingly. A house with an income of between £200 and £300 a year, a comfortable professional income, might employ 2 servants, a cook and a housemaid. Many employed only one, the general servant, or maid of all work, who did everything. Fact 17. The maid of all work was, by most measures, the hardest working person in the Victorian domestic system. She was typically young, often as young as 14 or 15, and had come from a working class or rural family, entering service as the most readily available form of employment for a girl of her background and education. She lived in the house she worked in, sleeping in a small room at the top of the house or in the basement, and she worked a day that began before 6 in the morning and rarely ended before 10 at night. Her duties were almost literally everything that needed doing: lighting the fires, carrying the coal, cleaning the grates, sweeping and scrubbing the floors, polishing the furniture, carrying the hot water, washing the dishes, doing the laundry, answering the door, serving the meals, running errands, and whatever else the household required. She did this 6.5 days a week, with half a day off on Sunday afternoon and perhaps 1 full day off per month, for a wage that in the 1850s was typically between £8 and £12 per year, plus her board and lodging. The physical toll of this work on a young woman's body was considerable, and the social isolation of a girl living in a household where she was neither family nor equal, where her relationships were professional rather than personal, where she ate alone or with one other servant, where she had no social life except in the stolen hours of her half-day off, was a form of loneliness that domestic advice writers of the period occasionally acknowledged and more frequently ignored. Fact 18. The relationship between the mistress of the house and her servants was one of the defining social relationships of Victorian middle-class life, and one of the most consistently discussed, debated, and complained about. From the mistress's perspective, the management of servants was one of her primary duties: hiring them, training them, directing their work, managing their disputes, dealing with their illnesses, their romantic entanglements, their thefts of small quantities of food or candles, their occasional catastrophic failures of competence or honesty. It was work that required constant attention and considerable interpersonal skill, and it was largely invisible, classified as domestic management rather than labor, acknowledged rarely and rewarded never. From the servant's perspective, the relationship looked quite different. The servant was dependent on her employer's character and goodwill in ways that went far beyond the economic. She lived in her employer's house. She ate her employer's food. She was subject to her employer's temper, her employer's standards, her employer's moral judgments. A servant dismissed without a character, the letter of reference that was essential for obtaining the next position, was effectively unemployable in domestic service and had few other options. The power differential was enormous, and the opportunities for its abuse were many and various. Fact 19. The Victorian concept of respectability, the social standard to which the middle class aspired and by which it judged itself and everyone around it, was, in large part, a domestic concept. Respectability was demonstrated through the maintenance of a clean and orderly house, the keeping of appropriate servants, the observance of correct social forms, the education of children according to accepted standards, the management of family finances within the constraints of income, and the projection of moral seriousness in all things. It was not simply about money, though money was part of it. Families of relatively modest income could maintain respectability through careful management of their domestic arrangements, while wealthier families could lose it through extravagance, disorder, or the failure to observe the forms. Respectability was a performance in the sense that it required constant active maintenance. It could not simply be assumed or inherited. It had to be demonstrated every day through the cleanliness of the front steps and the correctness of the calling card and the quality of the dinner served to guests. This performance was exhausting. It was also, for many Victorian families, the organizing principle of daily life, the framework within which every decision, from the choice of curtain fabric to the selection of a school for the children, was made and judged. Fact 20. The Victorian nursery, the room or rooms at the top of the house set aside for the children, was a world of its own within the house. Children in the Victorian middle-class household did not share their parents' living space in the way that modern children do. They inhabited the nursery under the supervision of the nurse or the nursemaid, and descended to the adult world of the drawing room and the dining room only at specific, managed times, for an hour in the afternoon perhaps, or after dinner on a Sunday, or for special occasions. The nursery was presided over by the nurse, a woman whose authority over the children was, during the long hours of the day when the parents were elsewhere, effectively total. The nurse fed, dressed, bathed, disciplined, and entertained the children according to her own understanding of what children needed, which was sometimes enlightened and sometimes extremely harsh, and frequently somewhere between the two. The relationship between a Victorian child and their nurse was often, paradoxically, the most intimate relationship of their early childhood, more present and more constant than the relationship with parents who appeared briefly, formally, and on schedule. Many Victorian autobiographies record the nursemaid or the nurse as the central emotional figure of early childhood and the loss of a beloved nurse, through dismissal or through the child's promotion to the schoolroom, as one of the first griefs of life. This is where part 1 ends. We have come inside the Victorian London house, descended to its basement, ascended to its nursery, met its servants and its family and its furniture and its smells. We have understood something of the physical and social architecture of the place, the way the house organized its inhabitants, the way it reflected and reinforced the social structures of the world outside it. In part 2, we go deeper into the daily rhythms. The morning that begins before dawn in the servants' quarters, the Victorian breakfast table, the elaborate rituals of the social day, the particular quality of a Victorian evening by the fire, and the long, cold, candlelit hours of the night. The house is dark. It is somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning, and the street outside is not yet fully awake. There are sounds, because London is never entirely silent, but they are the sounds of the earliest risers, the market carts and the night soil men finishing their rounds, and the first of the day laborers making their way through the cold streets toward wherever the day's work is. The fog, if it is November, sits on everything, on the rooftops, in the alleyways, thickening the darkness so that the gas lamps are visible only as smears of yellow in the gray. Inside the house, in the attic room or the basement room where she sleeps, the maid-of-all-work is already awake. She has been awake, in fact, for several minutes, lying in her narrow bed under her insufficient blankets, measuring the distance between the warmth of the bed and the cold of the room, and the certain knowledge that she has to get up now, before the household expects anything of her, because what the household expects of her takes a very long time to prepare. She gets up. She dresses quickly in the cold. There is no fire in her room at this hour. She puts on her working dress, her apron, her cap. She picks up her candle from the bedside and lights it from the tinderbox, a process that takes several attempts and produces a small, inadequate flame that does almost nothing for the temperature of the room, but at least allows her to see. She goes downstairs. And this is where the day begins. Fact 21. The first task of the morning in a Victorian house was the fires. Before the family appeared, before breakfast was prepared, before anything else could happen, the fires had to be laid and lit in every room that would be occupied during the day. This meant, in a typical middle-class house, at least 3 fires. The kitchen range, which had been banked up overnight and needed to be opened up and fed with fresh coal. The dining room fire, and the drawing room fire, with the possibility of additional bedroom fires if the mistress of the house was unwell or the weather was severe. Each fire required the same sequence of operations. The previous day's ash and clinker had to be removed from the grate and carried out, in a bucket, down the back stairs, out to the ash heap in the yard. The grate had to be cleaned, the iron blackened, the steel fender and fire irons polished. A new fire had to be laid. First paper, then kindling wood, then small coal, then larger pieces, arranged in the correct order for efficient combustion. Then it had to be lit and coaxed into burning properly, and left with enough fuel to maintain itself while she moved on to the next grate. The whole process, for 3 or 4 fireplaces, took the better part of an hour. It was cold, dirty, and physically demanding work. It was done every morning, 7 days a week, by the most junior female member of the household staff, who was typically also the youngest and the least paid. Fact 22. The housemaid's box, the container in which she carried her cleaning materials from room to room, was a piece of domestic equipment specific to the Victorian era, and now almost entirely forgotten. It was a wooden box or tray with a handle, containing everything she needed for her morning round. Black lead for the iron grates, a brush for applying it, a separate brush for polishing, a leather for the steel surfaces, soft cloths for the furniture, perhaps a small amount of lavender polish for the wooden surfaces. It was organized according to the system of the individual household, which might be the system established by the mistress or the system inherited from the previous housemaid. But it was always organized, because efficiency in these morning tasks was the difference between a morning that ran smoothly and a morning that ran into the family's breakfast time in a state of incomplete preparation. The housemaid's invisibility was a professional requirement. The ideal was that the work she did should appear to have done itself, that the fires should be burning, the rooms clean, the grates gleaming, the floors swept, the furniture dusted, without any visible evidence of the process by which these results had been achieved. The Victorians called this the seamless house, meaning a house in which the machinery of domestic management was invisible, conducted behind the scenes, completed before the family appeared. The seamlessness was the product of extraordinary labor. Its invisibility was the point. Fact 23. The Victorian breakfast was, by modern standards, an extraordinary meal. Not the breakfast of the very poor. That is a different story, and we will come to it. The breakfast of the middle-class London family in the 1850s was a substantial, varied, and carefully prepared meal that reflected both the nutritional demands of a population without central heating and the social aspirations of all class that understood the breakfast table as a form of self-presentation. The standard elements of a middle-class Victorian breakfast included a hot dish, typically a fish dish, kedgeree, which was a mixture of rice, smoked haddock, hard-boiled eggs, and butter, was extremely popular, or deviled kidneys, or mutton chops, or eggs prepared in various ways. There would be cold meats, cold bacon, cold tongue, sometimes cold roast beef left from the previous day's dinner. There would be bread, and sometimes rolls, with butter and marmalade and possibly honey. There would be porridge in winter. There would be tea and coffee, both prepared at the table by the mistress of the house, using a kettle kept hot on a spirit lamp, which was considered both a practical arrangement and a gesture of domestic intimacy, the mistress serving her family their morning drinks with her own hands. Fact 24. Kedgeree, one of the most characteristic dishes of the Victorian breakfast table, was a British adaptation of khichdi, an Indian dish of rice and lentils that British soldiers and administrators had encountered in India and brought home in a modified form. It is one of dozens of culinary borrowings from the Indian subcontinent that became standard elements of Victorian middle-class cooking, evidence of the degree to which the British Empire was not simply an economic and political project, but a cultural exchange, unequal, frequently exploitative, but genuinely two-directional in its effects on food, language, clothing, and domestic practice. The Victorian breakfast table was, in this sense, a small map of empire. The tea from India or Ceylon, the marmalade from Seville oranges imported through British trading networks, the kedgeree from the subcontinent, the coffee from the Caribbean or from East Africa, all assembled on a table in a terraced house in Islington and consumed by a family who might never have left England, and who did not necessarily connect any of these things to the vast imperial system that made them available. Fact 25. The dining room in which the Victorian family took its meals was a room of considerable formality, even for everyday family breakfasts and dinners. The table was set with a white cloth, changed at intervals according to the household standards, with the correct arrangement of cutlery for the number of courses to be served, glasses appropriate to the drinks to be offered, and whatever table decoration the household ran to, which might be a central arrangement of flowers or fruit in a more affluent house, or simply a clean and correctly laid cloth in a more modest one. The formality of the Victorian dining room was not simply social affectation. It was a practical mechanism for managing the family's social life, because the dining room was the room in which the family most often entertained guests, and the standard maintained for family meals was understood to be the standard available for company. A family that allowed its everyday dining to be careless and informal was a family that could not easily produce a correct formal dinner at short notice. And the inability to entertain properly was a social liability of real consequence. Fact 26. The Victorian dinner, the main meal of the day, served in the evening for the middle class, though still at midday for the working class and much of the rural population, was organized according to a system of service that was itself a social statement. The fashion in the 1850s was transitioning between two systems. The older service à la française, in which all the dishes of each course were placed on the table simultaneously, and guests served themselves, and the newer service à la russe, in which dishes were brought to each guest individually by the servant, one at a time. Service à la russe was more elegant, more modern, and more demanding in terms of both the number of servants required and the skill of the cook, who had to produce dishes that could be served individually at the correct temperature, rather than simply placed on the table. Its gradual adoption by the Victorian middle class through the 1850s and 1860s reflects both the increasing aspirations of that class and the increasing availability of domestic advice literature that told them what the correct standards were and how to achieve them. Fact 27. Mrs. Beeton's advice on the dinner party, contained in the Book of Household Management, which was first published in monthly parts from 1859 to 1861, is one of the most detailed and revealing documents of Victorian middle-class domestic aspiration. She provides menus for dinner parties of 6, 8, 10, and 12 guests at different seasons of the year and different levels of expenditure, with detailed instructions on the sequence of courses, the appropriate wines, the correct service, and the management of the servants during the meal. A formal dinner party for 8, in Mrs. Beeton's scheme, might consist of soup, fish, an entree, a remove, a large joint or a whole bird, another entree, a roast, game, a sweet dish, a savory, and dessert. This was not unusual. The Victorian formal dinner was not designed to be consumed quickly or lightly. It was designed to be a social occasion of several hours, during which the conversation, the wine, and the food were all elements of a performance staged for the benefit of the guests and reflecting on the hosts. The preparation of such a dinner by a single cook, or even a cook and one kitchen maid, in a basement kitchen with a coal range and no mechanical assistance whatsoever, was an achievement of considerable culinary skill and physical endurance. Fact 28. The calling card, the small, formally printed card bearing a person's name and sometimes their address, left at the homes of acquaintances during social calls, was one of the most important pieces of social technology in the Victorian middle-class world. The ritual of the morning call, during which a lady would visit the homes of her social acquaintances between the hours of approximately noon and 3 in the afternoon, was governed by a set of conventions so precise and so widely understood that a failure to observe them correctly could cause real social damage. If the lady of the house was at home to receive the caller was admitted to the drawing room, and the visit lasted between 15 and 20 minutes, long enough to be sociable, short enough not to impose. If the lady was not at home, or preferred not to be, for a caller she was less interested in receiving, the caller left her card with the servant who answered the door, bent at one corner in a specific way to indicate that she had called in person rather than sending the card by a servant. The corner-bending conventions were specific and were understood by everyone in the social world they operated in. A turned-down top right corner meant the caller had come in person. Different corners and different numbers of cards left indicated different social meanings. That all the ladies in the house were being called upon, that condolences were being offered, that congratulations were being extended. The card was a communication system, and like all communication systems, it required shared knowledge of its conventions to function. Fact 29. The at-home, the day or afternoon that a Victorian lady designated as the time when she would be available to receive callers, was a formal institution that organized the social calendar of the middle-class London household. A lady who kept regular at-home days, the first and third Tuesday of every month, for example, or every Thursday afternoon, was a lady whose social position was established and whose household was organized enough to support the regular reception of guests. The at-home required the drawing room to be in a state of readiness, the tea things prepared, the parlor maid available to answer the door and show callers up, and the mistress of the house in appropriate dress and disposition to receive company. It was a commitment of both time and domestic resources, and the lady who kept her at-home days reliably was demonstrating, week by week, that her household could sustain the effort. The at-home also served a practical social function. It was the mechanism by which relationships were maintained, news was exchanged, introductions were made, and the social network of the neighborhood and the acquaintance was kept active and functional. In a world without telephones, without email, without any instantaneous means of communication, the regular social call was how people stayed connected, and the at-home was its institutional form. Fact 30. The Victorian parlor game, the competitive and social games played by family groups in the drawing room on winter evenings and at Christmas, was a cultural institution of considerable importance in the domestic life of the 1850s. Charades, in which teams acted out syllables and words for the other team to guess, was extremely popular and could be elaborate and theatrical in its execution, with costumes and props assembled from whatever the household contained. 20 questions, consequences, crambo, a rhyming game, and various card games and board games were all part of the Victorian domestic entertainment repertoire. These games served a social function beyond simple entertainment. They were one of the few contexts in which the strict formality of Victorian social interaction could be relaxed, in which adults could be silly, could compete openly, could laugh loudly, could interact physically through a game's requirements, in ways that the drawing room's usual conventions would not have permitted. The parlor game was a sanctioned release valve for the social pressure of Victorian respectability, and it was taken seriously as such. Fact 31. Music was central to Victorian domestic life in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. The piano, or pianoforte, to use the full name that the Victorians preferred, was the defining domestic instrument of the period, and its presence in the drawing room of a middle-class house was so nearly universal as to be a social expectation rather than a luxury. A family without a piano in their drawing room was a family making a statement about their financial circumstances, usually an unflattering one. The ability to play the piano, and to play it well enough to perform for company, without embarrassment, in the drawing room of the family or of friends, was considered an essential accomplishment for a middle-class woman. Girls were taught from an early age, by a governess or by a music teacher who came to the house on specific days. The standard required was not simply the ability to play scales and simple pieces, but the ability to sight read with reasonable fluency, to accompany singers, and to perform from memory the drawing room repertoire of the period. Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, Chopin's easier nocturnes and waltzes, operatic arrangements, and the parlor songs that were the popular music of the day. Fact 32. The parlor song, the drawing room ballad, was the popular music of the Victorian middle class, sold as printed sheet music in vast quantities and performed at pianos in drawing rooms across the country. Songs like The Last Rose of Summer, Come Into the Garden Maud, The Banks of Allan Water, and Home Sweet Home were known to virtually every middle-class family in Britain, sung by amateurs at domestic musical evenings, and representing a shared musical culture of extraordinary breadth and consistency. The musical evening, an informal gathering at which family members and friends performed for each other, singing, playing instruments, perhaps reciting poetry, was one of the most common forms of middle-class domestic entertainment in the 1850s. It required no professional performers and no great expense beyond the cost of the sheet music and the preparation of some refreshments. It required only the willingness to participate, the modest musical education that most middle-class families provided for their children, and the drawing room with its piano and its gas lamps and its carefully arranged chairs. These evenings were not, by professional standards, remarkable musical events. They were, by the standards of human social life, something rather valuable, occasions on which people made something together in the same room and shared the result with each other in real time, with no recording equipment, no amplification, no audience beyond the people present. The imperfections were part of the event and were received accordingly. Fact 33. The Victorian bedroom was a different kind of room from the drawing room and the dining room. Less public, less carefully maintained in its formal readiness, more genuinely private. The master bedroom of a middle-class London house in the 1850s was typically furnished with a large iron or brass bedstead, a wardrobe or armoire for clothes, a washstand containing the basin and ewer used for morning washing, a dressing table, and whatever additional furniture the room could accommodate. The bed itself was an object of considerable complexity. The Victorian mattress was typically a palliasse, a flat mattress stuffed with straw or chaff, topped by a feather mattress, then sheets, blankets, and counterpane. The combination was warm but heavy, and the making of a Victorian bed, stripping it, airing it, turning the mattresses, remaking it with fresh linen on laundry day, was a substantial physical task. The bedroom fire was lit in the evening, in cold weather, by the housemaid, and allowed to die during the night. In the morning, the room was cold. The washing water, carried up by the maid, was the only immediately available hot water, and it was used for washing face and hands, and as much of the body as the cold of the room and the limitations of the available water allowed. The Victorian morning wash was not the shower of the modern era. It was a careful, sequential process, conducted with cold or tepid water in a cold room, and completed as efficiently as possible before descending to the comparative warmth of the dining room for breakfast. Fact 34. The Victorian attitude toward bathing was complicated and significantly different from modern practice. The full immersion bath, the kind that required a portable tub filled with cans of hot water, was typically taken weekly rather than daily on a fixed day of the week, in the bedroom or in a designated dressing room. The rest of the week's washing was done at the washstand, using the basin and ewer, in a process that the Victorians called an ablution, and that was both more and less than the modern shower, depending on how you measure it. This was not, as it might seem to a modern reader, evidence of unusual dirtiness. The Victorians who could afford weekly baths were considerably cleaner than the population of previous centuries, and their attention to cleanliness of hands, face, and teeth was genuine and frequent. They simply did not share the modern assumption that immersion of the entire body in water on a daily basis was either necessary or particularly desirable. The full bath was an event, a weekly ritual, rather than a routine daily hygiene measure. The household that could manage a weekly bath for every family member was, in the 1850s, a household of reasonable comfort. The household that could not, and many could not, managed with rather less, and the consequences in terms of personal cleanliness were a matter of degree rather than of absolute distinction. Fact 35. Laundry day in a Victorian household was an event of such disruption and labor that it is difficult to overstate. In most middle-class households, the laundry was done once a week, on Monday, a day that began early and ended late and dominated the entire household's routine from the morning until well into the afternoon. The washing itself required the heating of large quantities of water in the wash copper, a fixed copper vessel in the scullery, heated from below by a fire, the scrubbing of each item on the washboard, the rinsing, the mangling through a hand-cranked wringer, and the hanging out to dry in the yard, or, in wet weather, on a clothes horse in the kitchen or the scullery. Larger households, those with enough servants to manage it, sent their laundry out to a professional washerwoman or laundry, who would collect it on one day and return it ironed and folded several days later. This was more expensive than doing the laundry at home, but considerably less disruptive, and it was the preferred arrangement for households that could afford it. The laundrywoman who collected the household's linen was another of the regular figures of the Victorian street, as familiar and as necessary as the coalman and the milkman and the muffin man, and as completely invisible in most historical accounts. Fact 36. Ironing in the 1850s was done with a flat iron, a solid iron implement heated on the range or over the fire, tested for temperature by holding it close to the face or spitting on it, and watching the spit evaporate, and applied to the damp cloth with a pressing and pushing motion that required both physical strength and considerable skill to avoid scorching. A housemaid who scorched a good tablecloth or a family member's best shirt was not forgiven easily, and the replacement cost of good linen was sufficient for the incident to have financial consequences. Multiple irons were used in rotation, one on the fabric while the other heated on the range, because the iron cooled quickly in use and had to be returned to the heat at regular intervals. The ironing of a full week's household linen, including the family's clothes and the household's table and bed linen, was an afternoon's work at minimum, and in larger households considerably more. The ironing room, or the area of the kitchen where ironing was done, had a particular smell: clean hot cotton, the slight chemical sharpness of starch, the warm iron smell. That is one of the most immediately recognizable sensory signatures of the Victorian domestic interior. Several Victorian writers mention it specifically as one of the smells that meant home, that meant order, that meant the household machinery was working correctly and everything was as it should be. 37. The Victorian grocery shop, and the relationship between the middle-class household and the tradespeople who supplied it, was organized around a system of regular accounts and weekly deliveries that bears little resemblance to the modern supermarket. The household did not go to the shops. The shops came to the household, or rather, the household's orders were placed with the relevant tradespeople, who delivered the goods and recorded the purchase in a ledger, with payments settled weekly or monthly by the mistress of the house or her housekeeper. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the fishmonger, the dairyman, each had a regular relationship with the households they supplied, a relationship that was partly commercial and partly social, maintained through the courtesy of the tradespeople's assistants, who came to the kitchen door each morning to take the day's order, and through the honesty of their accounts, which were checked by the housekeeper against her own records, and any discrepancy pursued with the firmness that the domestic economy required. The quality of this relationship, the reliability of the tradesperson, the freshness of their goods, the accuracy of their accounts, was one of the factors that determined the smooth running of the Victorian household, and a reliable butcher or a trustworthy grocer was valued accordingly. Changing tradespeople was a decision made carefully, because the established relationship was a resource in itself. Fact 38. The street outside the Victorian London house was, in the 1850s, an extraordinarily busy and noisy place by modern standards. Not noisy with engines, but noisy with people and animals, and the percussion of a pre-mechanical urban economy. The iron-rimmed wheels of carts and carriages on the stone sets of the road produced a continuous rolling thunder that was the background noise of Victorian London, unvarying and unavoidable. Above it rose the calls of the street traders, vendors of food and household goods who moved through the residential streets, announcing their wares in distinctive cries that Londoners could identify without looking. The muffin man, who appeared in the late afternoons of autumn and winter, carrying his tray of muffins on his head and ringing his handbell, was perhaps the most culturally resonant of these figures. He appears in Victorian diaries and memoirs and children's books with a frequency that suggests genuine fondness. But there was also the lavender seller, the watercress girl, the cat's meat man selling scraps for householders' cats, the knife grinder with his wheel and his foot pedal, the chimney sweep calling for customers, the match seller, and the general literature of street commerce that was a distinctive feature of the Victorian urban soundscape. Fact 39. The crossing sweeper was a figure whose existence was entirely created by the specific conditions of the Victorian London street. The stone sets of the road surface accumulated horse manure at a rate that the various attempts at municipal cleaning could never fully address. And crossing a road, particularly at a junction, where the traffic convergence produced the greatest accumulation, was an unpleasant experience that deposited significant quantities of mud and worse on the shoes and hems of pedestrians. The crossing sweeper, typically a child or a very poor adult, stationed themselves at a busy crossing and kept a path swept clear, in return for which they expected a tip from the pedestrians, who benefited from their service. The institution was entirely informal, entirely voluntary on the part of the tipper, and entirely dependent on the mutual understanding that the service was being provided, and that some acknowledgment was appropriate. Charles Dickens's Joe in Bleak House is a crossing sweeper, and the character captures with precision both the precariousness and the social invisibility of the role, a child whose existence depends entirely on the goodwill of strangers who barely see him. Fact 40. The fog of Victorian London, the famous pea souper, the yellow-gray fog that descended on the city in autumn and winter and reduced visibility to a few yards, that seeped under doors and through windows, that deposited a fine coating of soot and sulfur on every surface it touched, was not a natural weather phenomenon. It was, in large part, a product of the city's domestic coal fires. The coal burned in the hundreds of thousands of domestic grates of London produced sulfur dioxide and soot particles in quantities that, in the still cold air of a temperature inversion, accumulated in the lower atmosphere to produce the characteristic Victorian fog, thick, acrid, tasting of coal smoke, turning handkerchiefs and collars gray within hours of exposure. The Victorians called it London particular, a term that captures its specificity and its peculiarity, the sense that this fog was a distinctively London product, as characteristic of the city as its architecture or its accent. The fog was a health hazard of measurable significance, particularly for the elderly and those with respiratory conditions. It also, in its denser forms, brought the city to a partial standstill. Horses walked slowly, their drivers peering into the murk, lampmen with torches guided vehicles through the worst intersections. Pedestrians followed the sound of the curb under their feet. A Victorian London fog at its thickest was a genuine emergency, and the literature of the period is full of accounts of its disorientation and its particular, slightly theatrical strangeness. The coal fire that warmed the Victorian house also, in aggregate with 10,000 others, produced the fog that hung over the Victorian city. It is one of the more precise ironies of the domestic history of the period. The warmth and the pollution were products of the same act, as inseparable as the fire and the smoke that rose from it. This is where Part 2 ends. We have spent the day inside the Victorian house and the Victorian street, from the servants' cold dawn to the family's evening in the gaslit drawing room, from the breakfast table to the calling card, from the fog outside to the piano inside. We have seen the machinery of domestic life in all its complexity and its labor and its occasional beauty. In Part 3, we go into the harder parts of the story, the disease, the poverty, the lives of those at the bottom of the Victorian domestic hierarchy, the rookeries and the courts and the single rooms where entire families lived in conditions that were less than 50 yards from the respectable terraces we have been visiting. And we go into the bodies of the people in those houses, what they ate and drank and suffered and feared, and how long they lived. There is a street in London that no longer exists. It was called Bleak Street, or something very like it. The Victorian habit of naming courts and alleys and passages with a grim accuracy that the modern city has largely abandoned. And it ran behind one of the respectable terraces we have been visiting, separated from the front gardens and the polished brass knockers by no more than 100 yards of brick and back wall. You would not have found it easily. It did not appear on the better class of map. Its existence was known to the people who lived in it, to the parish relieving officer, to the local surgeon who was occasionally summoned there, and to the missionaries and social investigators who ventured into these places with their notebooks and their carefully controlled expressions of Christian concern. To reach it, you turned off the main street, through an arched passage barely wide enough for two people to pass, and emerged into a court perhaps 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, enclosed on all sides by buildings of 3 or 4 stories that had once been something else. Warehouses, perhaps, or a larger house subdivided, and that were now occupied from basement to attic by families living one to a room, sometimes two to a room, sometimes more. The court had a standpipe in the center, which provided water for perhaps 3 hours a day. It had a privy in one corner, shared by every family in the court. It had no drainage worthy of the name, no gas lighting, no collection of rubbish. What it had was people, dozens of them, living at a density that the human body was not really designed to sustain, in conditions that produced disease with the reliable efficiency of a well-managed factory. This is the other half of the Victorian London house, and it is as much a part of the story as the drawing room and the kitchen range. Fact 41. The population density of the worst districts of Victorian London in the 1850s was, by any modern measure, almost incomprehensible. In the rookeries of St. Giles, the slum district behind what is now the eastern end of Oxford Street, cleared in the late 1840s and 1850s to make way for New Oxford Street. Census returns from the 1840s recorded densities of over 1,000 people per acre in the worst courts and alleys. For comparison, modern Manhattan, one of the most densely populated urban areas in the developed world, averages around 70 people per acre across the island. The people living at those densities were not there by choice. They were there because they could afford nothing better, because London's housing market in the 1850s had no lower floor below which a family could not be pushed, and because the casual labor economy of the city, the dock work, the street trading, the sweated industries of the East End, paid wages that made the single rented room the only realistic option for a family at the bottom of the economic scale. The single room was not a temporary arrangement. For many families, it was the permanent condition of their lives in London, the room in which they cooked, ate, slept, washed, worked, gave birth, fell ill, and died, all within the same 4 walls and the same 12 or 15 square feet per person. Fact 42. The cholera epidemic of 1853 and 1854, the third great cholera epidemic to strike London in the 19th century, killed over 10,000 people in the city. The disease moved through the overcrowded courts and alleys of the poorer districts with a speed and a lethality that made it one of the most feared medical events of the century. A person who appeared perfectly healthy at breakfast could be dead before nightfall. Cholera in its acute form worked with a horrible rapidity, producing the dehydration and collapse that killed its victims within hours of the first symptoms. The experience of living through a cholera epidemic in a Victorian London slum was one of concentrated terror. The disease was invisible. It could not be seen or smelled or heard approaching. It arrived without warning, struck apparently at random, and offered almost nothing in the way of treatment once it had taken hold. The medical profession's ability to intervene was limited to supportive measures, keeping the patient warm, providing fluids in whatever form could be administered, attempting to manage the symptoms. In the absence of an understanding of the disease's mechanism, these measures were sometimes helpful and more often inadequate. Fact 43. John Snow's investigation of the Broad Street cholera outbreak of August and September 1854 is one of the most celebrated episodes in the history of medicine, and it deserves its reputation. Snow was a physician with a particular interest in anesthesia. He had administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853, who had been skeptical of the miasma theory of disease for some time and had developed an alternative hypothesis that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water rather than through bad air. When the Broad Street outbreak began, killing over 500 people in 10 days in a densely populated district of Soho. Snow began a systematic investigation that was remarkable in its method and its rigor. He interviewed survivors and the families of victims, mapping each case onto a street map of the district and looking for a pattern in the distribution of deaths. The pattern, when it emerged, pointed with unmistakable clarity to a single water pump on Broad Street as the source of the contamination. Snow persuaded the local board of guardians to remove the handle of the pump, making it inoperable, and the outbreak subsided. He subsequently traced the contamination to a cesspit that had seeped into the well supplying the pump. His findings were published, debated, and initially resisted by an establishment committed to the miasma theory. But the evidence was eventually accepted, and Snow's work established the principles of epidemiological investigation that are still fundamental to public health practice today. Fact 44. The miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air, by the smell of rotting organic matter, by the general atmospheric corruption of overcrowded and insanitary places, was not simply ignorance. It was a coherent explanatory framework that accounted for most of the observable facts about disease distribution in Victorian cities. The places with the worst smells were indeed the places with the highest disease rates. The connection between filth and disease was real, even if the mechanism was wrong. The practical consequence of the miasma theory was, paradoxically, sometimes beneficial. If you believe that bad smells cause disease, you were motivated to remove the sources of bad smells, to drain the cesspits, to clear the refuse, to improve the ventilation of overcrowded buildings. These measures did not address the actual mechanism of disease transmission, but they often reduced it anyway, because the things that produced bad smells were frequently also the things that contaminated water and food, with the bacteria that caused disease. The Victorian sanitary reform movement, which drove the improvement of London's drainage and water supply through the second half of the 19th century, was motivated largely by miasmatic theory and produced results that were consistent with germ theory. It is one of history's more instructive examples of arriving at the right answer through the wrong reasoning. Fact 45. The General Board of Health, established by Parliament in 1848 in response to the cholera epidemic of that year, was one of the first central government bodies in Britain with a specific remit for public health. Its first commissioner was Edwin Chadwick, a reformer whose 1842 report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population of Britain had produced a statistical picture of urban poverty and disease that shocked even a political class accustomed to ignoring such things. Chadwick was not a lovable man. He was autocratic, inflexible, convinced of his own rightness on every point, and constitutionally incapable of the political diplomacy that might have made his reforms more palatable to the vested interests that opposed them. The water companies, the landlords, the local vestries that resisted any encroachment on their autonomy, all found in Chadwick an adversary whose righteousness was matched by his abrasiveness, and the Board of Health was abolished in 1854, partly because its work was necessary, and partly because the man running it had made so many enemies. But the work survived him. The sanitary reform movement he had energized continued, driven by the evidence of the cholera epidemics and by the work of investigators like Henry Mayhew, whose extraordinary documentary journalism, London Labour and the London Poor, published from 1849, brought the conditions of the city's poor into the drawing rooms of the middle class with a vividness and a specificity that made comfortable ignorance increasingly difficult to maintain. Fact 46. Henry Mayhew was a journalist, playwright, and co-founder of Punch magazine who spent several years in the late 1840s and early 1850s interviewing the street traders, laborers, and poor of London and publishing their accounts in the Morning Chronicle and subsequently in book form. His method was simple, and its results were extraordinary. He asked people to describe their lives in their own words, transcribed what they said with a fidelity to individual voice that was almost unprecedented in journalism of the period, and presented the result without editorial softening or moral commentary. The people who speak through Mayhew's pages are individuals, not types. The costermonger who explains the economics of his barrow trade with precise and unsentimental accuracy. The crossing sweeper who describes the geography of his patch and his relationships with the regular pedestrians who tip him. The sewer hunter, the man who made his living scavenging the brick sewers of the city for objects of value that had been washed in, who describes his work with a matter-of-fact professionalism that is simultaneously fascinating and appalling. These people lived in the courts and alleys and back streets behind the respectable terraces. They were the people who swept the crossings, collected the rubbish, delivered the coal, worked the docks, sold the muffins. They were as much a part of the Victorian London house as the family in the drawing room. They were the labor on which the drawing room depended, and their lives were lived at a distance of a few streets that might as well have been several worlds. At 47, the London that Mayhew documented was a city of casual labor, work that was available on some days and not others, that depended on the weather and the season and the state of trade and the energy and health of the individual worker, and that paid wages that were adequate in good weeks and catastrophic in bad ones. The casual laborer at the London docks, hired or not hired at the dock gates each morning, depending on how many men were needed that day, was one of the most economically precarious figures in the Victorian city. On a good morning at the dock gates, a few hundred men would be needed. Several thousand would present themselves. The selection was made by the dock foreman in a process that was opaque and subject to favoritism and corruption, and the simple arbitrary chance of which men he happened to see first in the crowd. The men who were not selected went home, or back to wherever they were sleeping, with nothing for that day, and the problem of feeding their families on that day's nothing. This was not exceptional. It was the normal condition of casual labor in the Victorian city, and it was the normal condition of a very large proportion of London's working population in the 1850s. The poverty that resulted was not the poverty of idleness or improvidence. It was the poverty of a labor market that could not absorb all the labor offered to it, at wages sufficient to sustain the workers who offered it. Fact 48. The workhouse, the institution of last resort for the Victorian poor who could not support themselves, was governed by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which had been designed by Chadwick and others on the principle that relief should be made as unpleasant as possible in order to deter the able-bodied poor from seeking it. The principle was called less eligibility. The condition of the pauper in the workhouse should be less eligible, meaning less desirable, than the condition of the lowest independent laborer outside it. In practice, this meant that the workhouse was designed to be experienced as a punishment, to stigmatize those who entered it, and to separate families, husbands from wives, parents from children, in order to reinforce the sense that entering the workhouse was a failure of the most serious kind. The separation of families was one of the most consistently hated aspects of the workhouse system, and it was deliberate. The architects of the Poor Law believed that the prospect of family separation would deter the improvident poor from allowing themselves to become destitute. What it actually deterred was primarily the self-respect of those who had no other option. People went to the workhouse when they had exhausted every other possibility, when they had sold everything, borrowed everything, begged everything, and still could not survive. And when they arrived, they were separated from their families and put to work at tasks designed to be humiliating and unproductive. Picking oakum, breaking stones, grinding grain by hand in buildings that had mechanical mills available, but used the manual method because it was more degrading. But 49. The Victorian child in the poor household inhabited a world almost entirely unlike the world of the middle-class nursery we visited in Part 1. Working-class children in 1850s London were not, in most cases, in school. The Education Act that would make elementary education compulsory did not come until 1870, and even after it came, compliance was imperfect, and the school-leaving age was set low enough that full-time work for children began very young by modern standards. Children in poor families contributed to the household economy from as early as possible. They ran errands, helped with piecework that the family brought home, the making of matchboxes, the sewing of sacks, the finishing of cheap garments, and when old enough, found their own work in the street economy, selling matches or flowers or newspapers, minding horses, sweeping crossings. The earnings were small, but in a household where the margin between adequacy and hunger was narrow, small contributions mattered. The Factory Acts and the Mines Act of the 1830s and 1840s had restricted child labor in specific industrial contexts. Children under 10 could no longer work in mines. Children under 8 could no longer work in factories. But these restrictions applied only to those sectors, and the vast informal economy of London's streets and sweated trades was not covered by any of them. A child of 6 or 7 selling flowers in Piccadilly was not breaking any law. A child of 10 helping his mother finish matchboxes in a tenement room was not breaking any law. The law had not yet caught up with the reality of child labor in the urban domestic economy. Fact 50. The ragged schools. Free schools established by charitable organizations to provide basic education to the poorest children of Victorian London, children who were too ragged and too dirty and too destitute to be admitted to the existing fee-paying or church schools, were one of the most characteristic philanthropic institutions of the 1850s. The Ragged School Union, founded in 1844 with the support of Lord Shaftesbury, coordinated a network of schools across London that by the mid-1850s was serving tens of thousands of children who would otherwise have received no education whatsoever. The schools were not comfortable places. They met in whatever premises were available: stable lofts, railway arches, old warehouses, and their pupils were, by definition, the children whose poverty was most extreme. The teachers were a mixture of volunteers and paid workers, and their task was both educational and social, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to children who were often hungry, sometimes ill, and always distracted by the more immediate concerns of survival. Charles Dickens visited the Field Lane Ragged School in Smyfield in 1843 and was moved enough by what he saw to write about it in a letter to a friend, describing it as a place of extraordinary human wreckage and extraordinary human resilience in roughly equal measure. The experience contributed to his thinking as he worked on A Christmas Carol, published in the same year, and to the two children, Ignorance and Want, whom the ghost of Christmas present conceals beneath his robe and reveals to Scrooge as the real dangers of social indifference. Fact 51. The pawnbroker was one of the most important financial institutions in the lives of London's poor in the 1850s, and one of the most completely ignored in conventional histories of Victorian finance. The pawn shop, identifiable by its 3 golden balls hanging above the door, a symbol inherited from the Lombard bankers of medieval Europe, provided short-term credit to people who had no access to banks, no savings, and no other means of bridging the gap between this week's need and next week's wages. The transaction was simple. The customer brought an object of value, a coat, a pair of boots, a piece of jewelry, a tool, and received in return a loan of a fraction of its value, with a ticket that allowed them to reclaim the object on repayment of the loan plus interest within a specified period. If the loan was not repaid, the object was forfeited and sold. For many families, the pawn shop was a weekly institution. The husband's Sunday suit went in on Monday and came out on Saturday, in time to be worn to church on Sunday, and went back in again on Monday. The suit was in pawn 5 days out of 7, serving simultaneously as clothing and as collateral. This arrangement, conducted with complete matter-of-factness by both parties, was a rational economic strategy in a world where income was irregular and credit was otherwise unavailable, and it sustained a pawnbroking industry of considerable size in every working-class district of Victorian London. Fact 52. The gin shop and the Victorian temperance movement that opposed it were both products of the same social condition: the availability of cheap alcohol in neighborhoods where it was one of the few affordable pleasures, and where its anesthetic qualities offered genuine, if temporary, relief from conditions of genuine difficulty. Gin had been cheap in London since the early 18th century, and its effects on the urban poor had been documented and deplored since Hogarth's Gin Lane in 1751. By the 1850s, the Gin Palace, the elaborately decorated, garishly lit, warmly welcoming public house that had replaced the older, grimmer gin shop, was one of the most visible institutions of working-class London, offering warmth, light, company, and oblivion in exchange for pennies that many of its customers could not really afford. The temperance movement, which grew substantially through the 1830s and 1840s, argued that alcohol was the cause of poverty rather than its consequence, that if the poor would only stop drinking, they would have the money and the clarity of mind to improve their circumstances. This argument was not entirely wrong, in that excessive alcohol consumption did compound poverty in many individual cases. But it was substantially wrong in its emphasis, because it located the cause of poverty in the moral failures of the poor, rather than in the structural conditions of the labor market and the housing market that made poverty a condition from which individual virtue could not reliably escape. The Gin Palace and the Temperance Hall faced each other across the streets of Victorian working-class London, one offering warmth and oblivion, the other offering warmth and salvation, and the poor chose between them according to their circumstances, their temperaments, and the particular condition of their lives on any given evening. Act 50. 3. The Victorian doctor, the general practitioner who attended the households of the middle class, was a figure of considerable social ambiguity in the 1850s. Medicine was in the middle of its long transformation from an art to a science, and the state of medical knowledge in 1850 meant that the doctor's ability to actually cure disease was severely limited. He could diagnose, sometimes accurately and sometimes not. He could prescribe from a pharmacopoeia that contained some effective remedies and a great many that were ineffective or actively harmful. He could perform surgery in an era before antisepsis and before effective anesthesia was universal, with results that were frequently catastrophic. And he could sit with the patient and provide the comfort of professional attention, which was sometimes the most valuable thing he had to offer. The introduction of chloroform and ether as surgical anesthetics in the late 1840s was one of the genuine medical advances of the period. It made surgery possible without the patient being conscious of the pain, which had previously been a limiting factor on what surgery could accomplish and how long it could take. But anesthesia without antisepsis still produced death rates from post-operative infection that were extraordinarily high by modern standards. And the surgeon's ward of a Victorian hospital in the 1850s was, as the medical reformer Florence Nightingale would observe in the context of the Crimea, a place where the disease you arrived with was frequently less dangerous than the disease you contracted there. Fact 54. Florence Nightingale's work in reforming nursing practice and hospital management, which she pursued with extraordinary energy and organizational brilliance from the mid-1850s onward, grew directly from her understanding of what Victorian hospitals were actually like, institutions in which the physical environment itself was a source of infection, where ventilation was inadequate, where sanitation was negligible, and where nursing was provided by women who had no training and no professional status, and who were sometimes, by the standards of the middle class, not entirely respectable. Nightingale returned from the Crimea in 1856 as the most famous woman in Britain, and she used that fame and the considerable political connections she had developed to drive the reform of military and civilian hospital practice through the remainder of her long life. She did not go back to nursing. She spent most of the rest of her life working from her bedroom, conducting an enormous correspondence, producing statistical analyses of hospital mortality that were among the first uses of data visualization in the history of medicine, and influencing government policy with a persistence and a political intelligence that were remarkable in a woman who had no formal political role. Fact 55. The Victorian Medicine Cabinet, the collection of remedies and preparations maintained by a middle-class household for the management of everyday illness, was a mixture of the effective and the useless that reflects the state of pharmaceutical knowledge of the period. Laudanum, a solution of opium in alcohol, was one of the most commonly used domestic remedies in Victorian England, available without prescription from any chemist, used for pain relief, for the management of anxiety, for the suppression of coughs, and for the quieting of fractious children. Its addictive potential was understood in principle, but not in practice. The Victorian medical establishment was aware that opium could produce dependence, but the concept of addiction as a medical condition, rather than a moral failure, was not yet established, and the use of laudanum in middle-class households was routine, unremarked, and occasionally catastrophic. Several prominent Victorian figures, De Quincey, Coleridge, Wilkie Collins among them, describe their relationship with opium in terms that make the nature of that relationship perfectly clear, and the domestic consumption of laudanum in Victorian England was vastly greater, in proportion to population, than the use of opiates in any comparable modern context. Fact 56. The Victorian attitude toward death was dramatically different from the modern one, and the Victorian house was the primary location in which death occurred and was managed. People died at home, in their own beds, in their own rooms, attended by their own families, nursed through the final illness by whoever in the household had the time and the constitution for it. The hospital was a place of last resort for those without families or without means, not a standard destination for the dying middle class. Death in the house required a series of domestic responses that were formalized into rituals of considerable precision. The mirrors in the house were covered, a tradition of uncertain but ancient origin, perhaps connected to the idea that the soul might be trapped in a reflection. The clocks were stopped at the moment of death. The curtains were drawn. A black wreath was hung on the front door, announcing the bereavement to the neighborhood. The body was laid out in the room in which the death had occurred, washed and dressed by the women of the household or by a nurse brought in for the purpose, and remained in the house until the day of the funeral. Fact 57. Victorian mourning dress and mourning conventions were among the most elaborate and precisely codified social rituals of the period. A widow in the 1850s was expected to wear full mourning, heavy black crepe, the dullest and most unreflective fabric available, covering the entire dress, for at least 2 years after the death of her husband, followed by a period of half mourning during which gray, lavender, and white could be gradually reintroduced. The conventions governing the mourning periods for other relatives, parents, siblings, children, in-laws, were equally specific, with different durations and different gradations of dress requirement. The expense of correct mourning dress was substantial, and the social pressure to maintain it was considerable. Mourning warehouses, shops specializing in the supply of mourning clothing and related goods, did a substantial trade in Victorian London, offering everything from the correct black-edged stationery and black sealing wax of condolence letters to the full wardrobe of a newly bereaved woman. Jay's Mourning Warehouse in Regent Street was one of the most prominent, advertising in the newspapers and maintaining a stock of ready-made mourning garments that could be acquired at short notice. Death, after all, rarely gave much warning. 58. The Victorian approach to grief was, in its formal aspects, communal and public in a way that modern grieving rarely is. The rituals of mourning, the drawn curtains, the black wreath, the correct dress, the calls of condolence, the careful observance of mourning periods, served a social function of marking and acknowledging the loss, and of organizing the community's response to it. Neighbors called, acquaintances wrote. The church provided the services. The rituals, for all their elaborateness, were a genuine form of social support, structured and reliable. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning for Prince Albert, who died in December 1861, was the most public and most extreme example of Victorian mourning practice. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, kept Albert's clothes laid out as though he might return, continued to have his shaving water brought to his dressing room each morning, and withdrew from public life to an extent that produced genuine public criticism in the 1860s and 1870s. Her behavior was unusual in its intensity, but it was not discontinuous from the mourning culture of the period. It was that culture pursued to its logical extreme by a woman of exceptional emotional intensity and exceptional position. Fact 59. The Victorian governess, the educated woman employed to teach the children of a middle-class family in their own home, occupied one of the most uncomfortable social positions in the Victorian household. She was educated enough to be treated as a social equal by the family she worked for, which meant she ate with them, participated in their social life, and was expected to maintain the dress and the manners of a lady. She was paid a wage, which meant she was a servant. She was neither one thing nor the other, and the household had no established social category that quite accommodated her. The discomfort of this position is widely acknowledged in Victorian fiction. The governess appears in novels by Charlotte Brontë, William Makepeace Thackeray, Anne Brontë, and many others as a figure of pathos and resilience, navigating the contradictions of her situation with varying degrees of success. Charlotte Bronte's own experience as a governess, which she described in letters as profoundly humiliating and isolating, informed Jane Eyre with an authenticity that readers recognized immediately and have not stopped recognizing since. The governess's vulnerability was particularly acute in the matter of her position's security. She could be dismissed at will, without the reference that would enable her to find a comparable position. She had no professional organization, no legal protections, no union. The governess's benevolent institution, founded in 1843, provided some support for governesses in distress, temporary accommodation, small loans, annuities for the elderly, and the establishment of Queen's College in London in 1848, which provided higher education for women in part specifically to equip governesses with better qualifications, was a response to the precariousness of their position and the inadequacy of the training that many of them brought to their work. Fact 60. The Victorian letter was the primary medium of personal communication across distance, and in the household of the 1850s, the writing, receiving, and managing of correspondence was a significant daily occupation. The penny post, the uniform penny postage introduced by Rowland Hill in 1840, which allowed a letter to be sent anywhere in the United Kingdom for 1 penny regardless of distance, had transformed letter writing from a luxury available to the wealthy into a routine activity of everyday life. By the 1850s, the post in London was delivered multiple times a day, up to 6 deliveries in central London, and a letter sent in the morning could expect a reply by the afternoon. This speed of communication within the city was almost electronic in its practical effect. Letters functioned for business and personal communication in a way that has more in common with email than with the modern postal service. The writing of a letter in the 1850s was an activity conducted at a writing desk or a table, with a steel pen dipped in an inkwell, on paper that was chosen with reference to the relationship and the occasion. Black-edged paper for morning correspondence, good quality white paper for formal letters, cheaper paper for everyday notes. The letter was folded, sealed with wax, addressed in copperplate handwriting, and taken to the postbox or collected by the postman who came to the door. The quality of a person's handwriting was considered a significant indicator of their education and their character, and children were taught to write a clear, regular copperplate hand as one of the primary skills of their schooling. A letter written in a poor hand was a letter that conveyed unflattering information about its writer before its contents were even read. This is where Part 3 ends. We have traveled through the harder and stranger parts of the Victorian London house, through the courts and alleys behind the respectable terraces, through the cholera wards and the workhouse gates, through the lives of the crossing sweepers and the costermongers and the maid-of-all-work, through the Victorian sick room and the Victorian death room and the Victorian mourning wardrobe. We have seen the full range of what it meant to live in London in the 1850s, from the comfort of the drawing room to the desperation of the single room in the overcrowded court. In Part 4, we return to the house one final time, to its evenings and its nights, to the particular quality of the Victorian domestic interior in the small hours, to the legacy of what the Victorians built, and what they believed and what they feared, and to the quiet ways in which the world they inhabited still shapes the world we live in now. The house is quiet now. It is somewhere past 10 o'clock in the evening, and the street outside has settled into its nighttime register, the last of the carriages returning from the theater or the dinner party. the distant sound of a night watchman's rattle, the fog pressing softly against the windows and turning the gas lamp outside into something diffuse and dreamlike. Inside, the drawing-room fire has burned down to a deep red glow. The piano lid is closed. The tea things have been cleared. The last of the candles on the mantelpiece has been pinched out, leaving a thin thread of smoke rising into the warm air of the room. The family is going to bed. This is not a quick process. Going to bed in a Victorian house involves a sequence of preparations that begins at least half an hour before the actual moment of sleep, and that requires the assistance of the servants who are, at this hour, themselves exhausted and waiting for the moment when the household's needs can finally be set aside and they can climb to their own rooms. The mistress of the house checks the locks. The master of the house winds the clocks. The one on the drawing-room mantelpiece, the one in the hall, perhaps the one in his study. The housemaid banks up the kitchen range for the night, fills the coal scuttle for the morning, sets out the materials for the morning's fires, and then takes her candle and climbs the back stairs to the attic, where her room is cold and her bed is narrow, and she will be required to be up again in fewer hours than is strictly reasonable. The family takes their bedroom candles from the hall table, each one in its own candlestick, each one sufficient to light the way upstairs and to read by for perhaps an hour before the candle burns down or the reader falls asleep. And they mount the front staircase in the particular companionable silence of people who have spent the evening together and have said everything they needed to say, and are now simply tired. Tonight, in the last part of this story, we stay in the house through those quiet hours. We look at what happens after the family has retired, at what the house sounds and feels and smells like in the small hours of a Victorian night, and at the long thread that runs from this house in 852 to the houses and the habits and the daily rhythms of the world we live in now. Fact 61. The Victorian night was darker than anything most modern city dwellers experience. The gas lamps in the street provided pools of light at intervals, but between them the darkness was genuine, and the interior of the house at night, once the candles were out and the fires had died to embers, was dark in a way that required adjustment. Not the urban darkness of modern cities, which is always tinged with the ambient glow of streetlights and illuminated windows, but a darkness in which you could hold your hand before your face and not see it. This darkness was managed in the Victorian household through a combination of candlelight and the dim persistence of the fire's glow, and through the simple fact that people went to bed earlier than modern habits suggest. The Victorian middle class in the 1850s typically retired between 10 and 11 in the evening and rose between 6 and 7 in the morning, a pattern more aligned with the natural rhythm of daylight hours than modern schedules tend to be. The artificial extension of the waking day by electric light, which would begin in the 1880s and become universal over the following decades, had not yet arrived, and the Victorian household organized itself around the limits of its artificial lighting in ways that have since been entirely forgotten. Fact 62. The sounds of the Victorian house at night were different from its daytime sounds in ways that its inhabitants were alert to. The settling of the building, the tick and creak of timber joists and floorboards contracting in the cold, was a nightly accompaniment to sleep, so familiar as to be unnoticed by those who lived with it and disconcerting to visitors who did not. The pipes, where the house had water pipes, knocked and gurgled. The fire in the bedroom settled into its embers with occasional pops and shifts of coal. The mice, which were universal in Victorian houses and which no amount of domestic management entirely eliminated, became audible in the walls and under the floors once the household quieted. Outside, the sounds of the street continued at a reduced level but never stopped. London in the 1850s did not have a silence, not even at 3 in the morning. The market carts began their pre-dawn runs very early. The night soil men came before dawn. The first of the day's laborers were in the streets by 5. The city breathed differently at night, but it never stopped breathing. And the household that slept above the street slept within the sound of the city, always. See the 3. The Victorian bedroom was also, for many families, a room of significant emotional importance beyond its function as a place of sleep. It was the room in which the most private conversations of a marriage took place, in which illness was nursed, in which children were born, in which people died. The Victorian domestic ideal placed the bedroom at the center of family intimacy, the hearth of the marriage, in a sense that the drawing room, with its public functions and its social performance, could not be. The marriage bed was an institution of Victorian domestic culture, understood both practically and symbolically as the foundation of the household. The elaborate conventions governing the making and maintenance of the marital bed, the quality of the linen, the changing of sheets on laundry day, the particular rituals of bed-making that the housemaid performed each morning, reflected the weight that the culture placed on what happened there, the births and the deaths and the private negotiations of a shared life. Fact 64. The Victorian middle-class marriage was, by modern standards, a relationship of considerable formal inequality. The Married Women's Property Act would not come until 1870, and in its early form it was limited in scope. A married woman in 1850s London had no independent legal identity, could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts, could not sue or be sued independently of her husband. Everything she owned became his on marriage. Any money she earned became his. If the marriage was unhappy, her options were extremely limited. Divorce required an Act of Parliament until 1857, when the Matrimonial Causes Act established the divorce court, and even then the grounds available to women were more restricted than those available to men. This legal framework did not mean that Victorian marriages were uniformly unhappy, or that women were uniformly powerless within them. The domestic sphere, the management of the house, the household finances, the children, the servants, the social calendar, was understood to be the wife's domain, and within it her authority was genuine, and her competence was respected. But the authority existed at the pleasure of the husband, and could not be asserted against him in law, which was a limitation of a fundamental kind, and one that the Victorian women who thought carefully about their situation found increasingly intolerable as the century progressed. 65. The Victorian woman who wanted to earn an independent income had very few respectable options. Teaching, as a governess or in a school, was the most consistently available. Writing was possible, and a significant number of Victorian women supported themselves wholly or partly by writing novels, journalism, and educational material, often under male pseudonyms or initials that concealed their sex. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, is the most famous example, but there were many others. The adoption of a male name or the suppression of a female one was not simply a commercial strategy. It was a response to the reality that work published under a woman's name was received differently, evaluated differently, and sometimes dismissed on those grounds alone. The needle trades, dressmaking, millinery, embroidery, employed large numbers of women in London in the 1850s, but in conditions that were frequently exploitative and at wages that were barely adequate. The seamstress who worked for one of the London dressmaking establishments in the season before a court ball or a major social occasion might work continuously for 18 or 20 hours at a stretch, in rooms where the gas lighting that allowed the night work also consumed the air and made headaches and eye-strain routine occupational hazards. Thomas Hood's poem, The Song of the Shirt, published in 1843, which described the life of a seamstress working herself toward death for a wage of starvation, was one of the most widely read and most emotionally effective pieces of social protest literature of the Victorian period. Fact 66. The Victorian reading habit, the practice of reading for pleasure in the evenings, alone or in family groups, was one of the defining domestic activities of the middle class, and the 1850s was one of the most remarkable decades in the history of English fiction. The novels being written and read in drawing rooms across London in that decade included works by Dickens. Bleak House was published in monthly parts between 1852 and 1853. Little Dorrit between 1855 and 1857. William Makepeace Thackeray was publishing. Elizabeth Gaskell published North and South in 1854 and 1855. Anthony Trollope published The Warden in 1855 and Barchester Towers in 1857. These novels were read in a context that gave them a different relationship to their audience than modern fiction enjoys. They were published in serial parts, monthly or weekly installments, each one a discrete episode in an ongoing story, and the reader's experience was one of genuine suspense between installments, of talking about the characters with friends and family as though they were real people about whom news was expected, of writing letters to the author when something in the story provoked a strong response. Dickens received substantial correspondence from readers of his serials, and he was known to modify his plots in response to strong reader reactions. A feedback loop between writer and audience that has more in common with modern television drama than with the typical experience of reading a novel today. Fact 67. The serial novel was sold in monthly parts at a shilling each, or in weekly parts at a penny or 2p, making it accessible to a much wider readership than the 3-volume novel, the standard format for a new work of fiction, which cost 31 shillings and 6p and was beyond the means of most working-class readers. The circulating library, most famously Moody's Select Library, founded in 1842, provided middle-class readers with access to new fiction for a subscription of £1 a year, which entitled the subscriber to borrow 1 volume at a time from a stock that ran to tens of thousands of titles. Moody's Select Library was also, effectively, a moral censor of Victorian fiction. Moody selected which books to stock and in what quantities, and a novel that Moody refused to stock had its commercial prospects seriously damaged. Moody's criterion for selection was propriety. The books he stocked had to be suitable for family reading, for the drawing room, for the mixed audience of adults and older children who shared the family's reading in the evenings. This criterion shaped what Victorian novelists wrote, often in ways they found constraining, and it contributed to the particular combination of moral seriousness and psychological subtlety that characterizes the best Victorian fiction. The novel had to be decent, but decent novels written by serious artists found ways of being decent that were also, within their decorums, extraordinarily frank about human nature. Fact 68. The Victorian relationship with religion was more complex and more various than the popular image of a uniformly pious society suggests. The middle class attended church, the Church of England in most cases, with nonconformism, Methodism, Congregationalism, Unitarianism, providing alternative homes for those whose theological or social preferences ran in that direction. Sunday observance was the norm. Church in the morning, a quiet afternoon, no commercial activity, a family dinner, perhaps church again in the evening. The Sabbath was kept, in middle-class households, with a degree of formality that modern sensibility finds difficult to fully imagine. But private belief was more variable than public observance suggested. The 1850s was one of the decades in which the intellectual foundations of Victorian religious certainty were most seriously challenged by geologists whose findings about the age of the earth were inconsistent with a literal reading of Genesis, by biblical scholars whose analysis of Scripture was producing increasingly uncomfortable questions about its historical reliability, and by Darwin, whose On the Origin of Species would appear in 1859, and whose implications were already being anticipated in scientific circles throughout the decade. The Victorian family that knelt for morning prayers, attended church on Sunday, and said grace before every meal was frequently also a family, in which at least one member was quietly, sometimes agonizingly, uncertain about the foundations of what they were observing. The tension between faith and doubt is one of the defining psychological experiences of the Victorian educated class, and the domestic privacy of the house was where that tension was most honestly felt, most carefully concealed, and occasionally most candidly expressed. 69. The Victorian Christmas, as it is understood today, the decorated tree, the exchange of gifts, the family gathering, the turkey dinner, the crackers and the pudding, and the carol singing, was largely an invention of the 1840s and 1850s, shaped by a combination of German influence brought by Prince Albert, the commercial activities of the toy and gift trades, and the particular genius of Charles Dickens for identifying and amplifying the emotional potential of a cultural moment. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, did not invent the English Christmas, but it codified it. It gave the season a moral and emotional framework, a set of values and images and aspirations that subsequent decades filled in with practices and traditions that felt ancient but were often relatively recent. The Christmas tree, popularized in Britain partly through a widely reproduced illustration of the royal family gathered around their decorated tree at Windsor, became a middle-class institution in the 1840s and 1850s. The sending of Christmas cards began in 1843, when Henry Cole commissioned an illustration from John Calcutt Horsley and had it printed for distribution to friends. The turkey as the Christmas bird, displacing the goose that Scrooge buys the Cratchit family in A Christmas Carol, became standard in middle-class households through the 1850s and 1860s. The Victorian Christmas that we recognize, in other words, was assembled in roughly the decade of our story, in roughly the houses we have been visiting, by families who were simultaneously creating a tradition and experiencing it as though it had always been there. Fact 70. The Victorian house changed over the course of the 1850s in ways that reflected the broader changes of the decade. The repeal of the window tax, a tax on the number of windows in a house, abolished in 1851, allowed houses to be built and renovated with more and larger windows, admitting more light to interiors that had previously been deliberately kept dark to minimize tax liability. The gradual extension of the gas supply network brought gas lighting to more rooms and more houses through the decade. The development of the water closet and the gradual improvement of sewerage in the better-managed boroughs made indoor sanitation slowly more common. By the end of the decade, the house we have been visiting was slightly different from the house it had been at the beginning. Brighter, slightly cleaner, slightly less dependent on the privy in the backyard, slightly better connected to the growing infrastructure of the city. The changes were incremental, uneven, and contested at every point by the cost of improvement and the resistance of those who benefited from the existing arrangements. But they were real, and they were the beginning of a transformation that would, by the end of the Victorian period, have changed the domestic interior almost beyond recognition. Fact 71. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace, the extraordinary iron and glass structure designed by Joseph Paxton and erected in Hyde Park, was the defining public event of the early 1850s and the one that most completely expressed the self-image of the age. 6 million people visited it over 5.5 months, including enormous numbers of working-class visitors who traveled to London specifically to see it, many of them making their first railway journey for the purpose. The exhibition displayed the manufactured goods and the industrial achievements of Britain and of nations from across the world: machinery, textiles, ceramics, furniture, scientific instruments, weapons, carriages, and objects of every conceivable kind, arranged in a building that was itself one of the most remarkable objects on display. It was an assertion of British industrial supremacy and an expression of the Victorian confidence that the application of human intelligence and industrial energy to the problems of the world was producing results of genuine and continuing improvement. The domestic goods on display, the furniture, the carpets, the ceramics, the decorative metalwork, gave many visitors their first sight of the objects that the prosperous middle-class house contained, and the exhibition contributed to the spread of middle-class domestic standards and aspirations among a wider population than had previously had access to them. In this sense, it was one of the mechanisms by which the Victorian domestic ideal, the clean, ordered, comfortable, aspiring house, became not just a middle-class reality, but a working-class aspiration. The Victorian philanthropist, the wealthy or moderately wealthy individual who directed a portion of their income and their energy toward the improvement of the conditions of the poor, was one of the most characteristic figures of the 1850s, and one whose legacy has been both celebrated and criticized by subsequent generations. The charitable institutions of Victorian London, the hospitals, the ragged schools, the reformatories, the missions, the housing associations, were largely the product of individual philanthropic effort, organized through voluntary associations, and driven by a combination of Christian obligation, social conscience, and, sometimes, a more complicated mixture of motivations that included the control of the poor, as well as their improvement. George Peabody, the American banker and philanthropist who established the Peabody Trust in 1862 to provide decent housing for London's poor, was one of the most consequential. The Peabody Buildings, solid, austere blocks of model dwellings built to standards of ventilation and sanitation that were genuinely superior to most of what was available to the working class, still stand across London, still providing social housing to thousands of tenants, over a century and a half after their construction. They are not beautiful in any conventional sense. They were designed for durability and utility rather than aesthetic pleasure, but they represent a genuine and lasting contribution to the lives of the people who lived in them. The Victorian kitchen garden, the garden at the rear of a suburban or semi-rural house, used to grow vegetables, soft fruit, and herbs for the household's table, was a feature of middle-class domestic life that combined the practical and the aspirational in characteristic Victorian fashion. Gardening was promoted throughout the period as a morally improving activity, wholesome, rational, productive, connected to the natural world in ways that urban life tended to sever. The houses of inner London, with their small backyards paved in stone, could not run to a kitchen garden. But the houses of the growing suburbs, the semi-detached and detached houses being built in Clapham and Peckham and Chiswick and Ealing through the 1850s and 1860s, had gardens that were large enough for the cultivation of strawberries and currants, of potatoes and cabbages and peas. And the suburban garden became one of the defining features of the Victorian middle-class domestic ideal, a small piece of productive nature held in reserve against the encroachments of the urban world. The flower garden, the ornamental garden at the front of the house, maintained for appearance rather than production, was equally important as a social statement. A well-kept front garden, with its seasonal bedding plants and its neatly edged path and its clipped shrubs, was the domestic equivalent of the polished front step, an announcement to the street of standards maintained and aspirations upheld. Fact 74. The Victorian pet, and the Victorian relationship with domestic animals more generally, was a subject of considerable cultural significance and considerable social variation. The middle-class family kept dogs, and the Victorian dog was not the outdoor working animal of the pre-industrial world, but a domestic companion, admitted to the house, given a name and a personality, mourned when it died. The lapdog, the small decorative breed carried by ladies of fashion, was a fixture of fashionable Victorian life and a subject of some satire. But the working and sporting breeds kept by the middle and upper classes were genuine companions, given a place in the household that reflected the Victorian understanding of loyalty, affection, and domestic warmth. The cat, less socially valued in the Victorian period than the dog, and associated more with the kitchen and the servants' quarters than with the drawing room, served a practical function as a mouser in every household that could keep one, and was fed on scraps and tolerated rather than celebrated in most accounts of the period. The canary in its cage, the goldfish in its bowl, the caged parrot in the drawing room, these were the decorative animals of the middle-class interior, contributing to the general sense of living richness that the Victorian drawing room aimed to project. 75. The Victorian attitude toward nature, toward the natural world beyond the city, toward the countryside, toward the sea, was shaped by the particular experience of a class that had recently and rapidly urbanized, that lived in cities by economic necessity, but retained an imaginative relationship with the countryside that was partly nostalgic and partly romantic and partly genuinely therapeutic. The seaside holiday, made possible by the railway, as we noted in an earlier part of this story's companion piece on steam trains, was one of the mechanisms by which the urban middle class maintained its connection with the natural world. The annual family migration to the seaside, to Brighton or Eastbourne or Bournemouth or Whitby, was a regular feature of middle-class Victorian life, anticipated through the grey months of the London winter and remembered through the grey months of the following autumn, providing a counterweight to the coal smoke and the fog and the confinement of the city house that was both physical and psychological. The countryside holiday, the summer weeks spent in a rented cottage or in the house of relatives in the rural counties, served a similar function and was pursued with similar enthusiasm by those who could arrange it. The contrast between the city house and the country house, between the gas-lit drawing room and the candle-lit cottage, between the London fog and the open fields, was a contrast that the Victorians felt acutely, and that found its way into the literature and the painting and the domestic ideology of the period in ways that are still visible today. Fact 76. The Victorian house that we have been visiting throughout this story was not, by the standards of the period, an unusual, or exceptional place. It was a typical middle-class London house of the 1850s, comfortable, aspiring, properly maintained, staffed by 2 or 3 servants, inhabited by a family of 4 or 5, located in one of the long residential streets of a district that was then considered respectable and that has, in many cases, remained so. It was a house of its time, shaped by the values and the constraints and the possibilities of the decade that produced it. What is unusual is simply that we have gone inside it, that we have moved through its rooms and its routines, that we have sat at its breakfast table and stood in its kitchen, that we have heard its morning sounds and its evening sounds and the particular silence of its small hours. Most of what happened in that house was never recorded. The housemaid's morning round, the cook's weekly menus, the family's evening conversations, the children's games in the nursery. These things left no documents, generated no archives, attracted no attention from the historians and the journalists and the social investigators who were documenting other aspects of the period. They were simply life, happening in a house, in a street, in a city, in a decade that was important for reasons that had nothing to do with the particular house or its particular family, and that the family experienced not as history, but as Tuesday. Fact 77. The physical fabric of the 1850s London house has survived, in large numbers and in various states of preservation, into the present. The terrace streets of Islington, of Canonbury, of parts of Brixton and Camberwell and Hackney and Bermondsey, streets that were built in the 1840s and 1850s, and that have been inhabited continuously since then, are among the most direct physical connections available to us with the Victorian domestic world. The houses have been modified, updated, extended, their interiors transformed beyond recognition, their coal cellars converted to playrooms or storage, their kitchen ranges replaced several times over by gas cookers and then by electric ones. But the exteriors, the London stock brick, the stucco fronts, the sash windows, the black front doors, the iron railings, are in many cases almost unchanged. Walking down a street of Victorian terraced houses in Islington on a November evening, with the windows lit from within, and the fog, if there is any, is softening the streetlights, which are now LED and cold and nothing like the warm yellow of gas. You can feel, if you are paying attention, something of the quality of the world we have been describing. Not the smell of it, not the cold of it, not the social weight of it, but the shape of it, the particular human scale of the terraced house, the rhythm of the street, the sense of a city organized around domestic life in a way that feels both familiar and remote. Fact 78. The legacy of the Victorian domestic interior in the material culture of the present is pervasive and largely invisible. The conventions of domestic space that the Victorians established, separate rooms for separate functions, a hierarchy of public and private spaces within the house, designated areas for children and for servants and for formal reception and for family relaxation, are still recognizable in the organization of modern homes, even those that bear no architectural relationship to their Victorian predecessors. The idea that the kitchen should be separate from the living space, that there should be a distinction between the formal and the informal areas of a house, that the bedroom is a private space and the sitting room a semi-public one. These conventions, which feel natural and inevitable, were established in their modern form in the Victorian terraced house of the 1840s and 1850s, and they have persisted through every subsequent architectural fashion and every subsequent transformation of domestic technology. The open-plan kitchen living room, which has become the dominant form of new domestic design in Britain and America in the 21st century, can be understood partly as a deliberate rejection of these Victorian conventions, a statement that cooking and living are not to be separated, that the kitchen is not a servant's domain but a family space, that domestic life should be organized around the activities of those who inhabit it rather than around the management of social appearances. Whether this represents progress or a different set of values, or simply a different set of economic circumstances, the absence of servants making the separation of kitchen and living space less practical is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Fact 79. The Victorian domestic ideal, the clean, ordered, comfortable, morally serious, aspiring household, was an ideal that the Victorians themselves frequently failed to achieve, and that the society around them made achievement difficult for a very large proportion of the population. The house we have been visiting, with its fires and its servants and its calling cards and its piano, was the ideal, not the universal reality. The reality, for much of London's population in the 1850s, was considerably less comfortable and considerably more precarious. The single room, the shared privy, the intermittent water supply, the casual labor, and the seasonal poverty, and the constant proximity of disease. These were the conditions in which a substantial majority of the city's 2.5 million people actually lived. The gap between the ideal and the reality was one of the defining social tensions of the Victorian age, and the social reform movements that the Victorians generated, the sanitary reform, the housing reform, the education reform, the labor reform, were all, in different ways, attempts to bridge it. The gap has not been entirely bridged in the century and a half since, but it has been substantially narrowed, in ways that the reformers of the 1850s would recognize as the fruit of their efforts, and that the occupants of the single room in the overcrowded court would recognize as something worth having fought for. Fact 80. The woman who managed the Victorian middle-class house, the mistress of the household, the wife and mother who directed the servants and organized the social calendar, and managed the finances, and raised the children, and maintained the standard of the domestic interior that the family's respectability required, did all of this without wages, without professional recognition, without legal independence, and without the possibility of stopping. She was, by any measure, one of the most productive workers in the Victorian economy. The domestic labor that she directed, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the childcare, the household purchasing, the social management, had a real economic value that the Victorian period conspicuously failed to acknowledge. The separate spheres ideology that consigned women to the domestic world, while reserving the public world of commerce and politics for men, was not simply a social convention. It was an economic arrangement that extracted enormous amounts of unpaid and unacknowledged labor from half the population. The Victorian women who challenged this arrangement, who insisted on access to education, to the professions, to the vote, to legal independence, were challenging not just a social convention, but an economic system. And they did so in the drawing rooms and at the writing desks of the very houses we have been visiting, in the hours between the morning calls and the evening piano practice, and the management of the servants and the raising of the children. The world they were making arguments for was not yet the world they lived in. But the arguments they were making in those gaslit drawing rooms, in those carefully maintained terraced houses, in those domestic interiors that the broader culture told them were their proper and entire sphere, Those arguments were, slowly and imperfectly, and against considerable resistance, eventually heard.